You are standing inside Whitehall Palace, winter 1547. Outside these walls, England is being told that the king is well. Royal proclamations still repeat the same careful words: hale and hearty, strong, commanding, untouchable. But you know the truth, because you are behind the locked doors. In here, the Lion of England is dying. No one dares to say it aloud. They whisper instead. The lion is dying, not in sorrow, in fear. Henry VIII, the man whose signature alone meant life or death, now lies motionless in a darkened chamber, his breath thick and labored, the air heavy with incense that cannot fully conceal the stench of a body already beginning to rot. You are not allowed to speak of it. No one is. Because the moment England learns the king is failing, power will begin to move even before his heart stops. Along the stone corridors of the palace, courtiers avoid each other's eyes, not out of loyalty, out of calculation. Who will control the child who comes next? Who will strike first? Who will survive when the secret escapes the room? Henry VIII understands all of this. Even through the pain, he knows one thing with brutal clarity. His death is his final weapon. That is why this chamber is sealed. That is why only a chosen few are permitted to enter. And that is why what you are about to hear has been concealed for nearly 500 years. Because the official image of Henry VIII, the broad-shouldered king, legs planted wide, daring the world to challenge him, is a lie. The man on the bed is not a symbol of strength. He is a body in collapse. And what makes this story truly disturbing is not that a king is dying. It is this. Henry VIII did not become a monster at the end of his life. He became one long before, and his own body was simply the last thing that dared to betray him. The road to this grotesque ending did not begin with blood-soaked marriages. It did not begin with shocking executions. It began when Henry VIII was the brightest promise of Renaissance Europe. And to understand why this lion dies in isolation, decay, and fear, you must return to the moment when no one believed such an ending was possible. You have to leave the darkness of Whitehall behind. To understand what you are witnessing in 1547, you must go back decades earlier, to a time when this ending seemed impossible. You are now standing in the court of a young Henry Tudor, and nothing about him suggests decay. This Henry is tall, broad-shouldered, athletic. He moves with confidence, not caution. He rides, hunts, dances, jousts, and wins. Across Europe, ambassadors report the same thing. England's new prince is everything a Renaissance king should be. He speaks multiple languages. He writes music. He debates theology for pleasure. Most importantly, he looks invincible. This is not a man haunted by fear. This is a man who believes his body will always obey him. And for a time, it does. You watch him in the tilt yard, armor gleaming, crowd roaring. Horse and rider charge. The impact is thunderous. This is where the myth begins. But this is also where the damage starts. Henry is injured more than once. Hard falls, blows to the head. A catastrophic jousting accident later in life will leave him unconscious for hours. At the time, no one calls it dangerous. Kings are meant to endure pain. Kings are meant to push through, and Henry does. What no one understands, what no one can understand yet, is that the body keeps records. Injuries accumulate, trauma compounds, and recovery is never complete. Still, the image holds. Henry becomes king in 1509, only 18 years old. Young, charismatic, married to Catherine of Aragon in a display of confidence and legitimacy. England celebrates. Europe watches. But beneath the splendor, a pressure begins to build. Henry needs a son. Not an heir in theory. A living, breathing male body to carry his blood forward. Daughters are not enough. Legitimacy is fragile. Dynasties collapse when the body fails. And so the obsession begins. Pregnancy after pregnancy ends in disappointment. Miscarriages. Stillbirths. Infant deaths. Each failure is not just personal. It is political. And Henry takes it personally. You can feel the shift. The easy confidence hardens into control. Charm becomes entitlement. Affection becomes conditional. The king begins to equate obedience with loyalty and resistance with betrayal. This is where blood enters the equation. Because once you believe your dynasty is under threat, everything becomes justified. Marriage becomes strategy. Religion becomes a tool. Law becomes whatever the king needs it to be. Henry does not set out to become a tyrant. He becomes one by refusing to accept limits. Limits of tradition, limits of faith, limits of the human body. When the church refuses him a divorce, he does not compromise. He breaks England away from Rome. Not for doctrine, not for reform, but because his will has been denied. This is the critical moment. The point where Henry learns that institutions can be reshaped. If you are ruthless enough, executions follow. Former friends, trusted advisors, then wives. One by one, the circle tightens. And with each act of control, the king becomes more isolated, more suspicious, more volatile. Yet the image remains intact. Portraits show strength. Ceremony projects certainty. Fear does the rest. No one is allowed to say that Henry has changed. No one is allowed to say that the Golden Prince is hardening into something darker. And no one is allowed to notice that the king is gaining weight, moving less, recovering more slowly. The body is beginning to fail. But Henry is not listening. Because a man who has bent the church, the nobility, and the law to his will, cannot imagine that flesh and bone might refuse him too. That realization will come later, when the body begins to rot. And when it does, Henry VIII will discover something he has never faced before, a power he cannot command. You return to Whitehall. But this is no longer the palace of ceremony. It is a sick room. The transformation is unmistakable. The man who once rode for hours now struggles to stand. The king who dominated the tilt yard can no longer walk unassisted. Henry VIII's body has begun to rebel. His legs are the worst. They are swollen, misshapen, wrapped in layers of cloth, soaked through again and again. Beneath the bandages, the skin has broken open into suppurating ulcers, raw, weeping wounds that refuse to heal. The smell reaches you before you see them. A thick, sickly stench of rot and infection hangs in the air, so overpowering that even seasoned courtiers fight the urge to retch. Incense burns constantly, not for prayer, but for survival. You watch servants avert their eyes as they move around the bed. Not out of respect, out of revulsion and fear. Henry is enormous now. Some accounts suggest his weight has swollen to nearly 400 pounds. His body must be lifted with mechanical devices, pulleys, harnesses, straps. This is no longer a king who moves through space. This is a body that must be managed. His once handsome face is distorted, bloated, yellowed. His eyes sink deep into flesh that looks stretched and unhealthy, as if it no longer fits the bone beneath. The royal physicians are desperate. They have exhausted everything their world can offer. Bloodletting, again and again, to release the bad humors. Poultices of boiled onions, herbs, and animal fats pressed into open wounds. Powdered human skull mixed into concoctions believed to draw out corruption. None of it works. If anything, it makes the pain worse. Modern historians looking back see what Henry's doctors could not. Type 2 diabetes, ravaging his circulation. Gout, locking his joints in agony. And most likely, osteomyelitis, a bone infection that eats from the inside out. The king is living with constant pain. Pain that never fully recedes. Pain that sharpens his temper and erodes his patience. Even the slightest movement can trigger spasms so violent that Henry screams that echo through the stone corridors of Whitehall late into the night. The palace hears them. No one speaks of them. Opium becomes the only mercy. Given liberally, it dulls the agony enough for Henry to sleep, but at a cost. His mind clouds. Time blurs. Lucidity fractures. You begin to notice the change. Moments of explosive rage give way to long periods of vacant lethargy. He lashes out at servants, then stares past them as if they are not there. He forgets conversations, repeats himself, drifts. The body is not just failing. It is dragging the mind down with it. This is the humiliation Henry VIII cannot endure. He has commanded armies, broken the church, executed queens. And yet here, in this bed, he cannot command his own flesh. The doctors do not dare tell him the truth. They cannot. To admit that the king's condition is hopeless would be to admit failure, and failure at this level can mean death. So they continue. More poultices, more bleeding, more prayers. They cut pigeons in half and bind the still warm bodies to Henry's legs, believing life might draw life. They apply experimental mixtures of gold dust and crushed gemstones, expensive remedies for a patient who must be seen to receive everything. Nothing stops the decay. The ulcers deepen. Some accounts whisper that bone is visible through necrotic tissue. The king knows. He may be drugged, but he is not blind. You see it in the way he grips the sheets, in the way his jaw tightens when servants approach his legs, in the way he snaps when someone moves too slowly. This is not just pain, it is betrayal, because Henry has always believed that power flows from the body. Strength, presence, command. Now the body is exposing the lie. And as the flesh rots, so does restraint. Henry's temper, once controlled, becomes volcanic. Punishments grow harsher. Mercy disappears. The body is failing, and the king responds the only way he knows how, by tightening his grip on everyone else. By the time you leave the chamber, one truth is unavoidable. The Golden Prince did not fall because he lost power. He fell because the one thing he could never control, his own body, had finally turned against him. And this is only the beginning. Because when the body collapses, the mind is never far behind. You notice it before anyone dares to say it. Henry's body is breaking, but his mind is going with it. At first, it is subtle. Moments of irritation stretch into rages. Silence becomes suspicion. Every delay feels deliberate. Every glance feels like judgment. Pain has stripped away restraint. The king no longer sleeps properly. Opium drags him under, then releases him suddenly, without warning. Time fractures. He wakes unsure if it is night or morning. He forgets who last spoke to him. He repeats the same questions again and again, louder each time. You watch courtiers freeze when Henry stares at them too long. Not because he is angry, but because he seems confused. Sometimes he speaks clearly, sharply, coldly, and then, without transition, he drifts. His eyes fix on corners of the room where no one stands. His mouth moves before sound emerges. Names slip out, names he should not speak. Men he executed, women he destroyed, friends who begged. In the dim candlelight, Henry murmurs as if answering voices only he can hear. You realize something unsettling. The king is no longer fully in control of his own thoughts. The pain never leaves him. It pulses. It grinds. And pain changes how the mind works. Henry becomes volatile. A servant moves too slowly, he explodes. A physician hesitates, he threatens their life. A counselor speaks too carefully, Henry accuses them of betrayal. Every interaction is a test. Every test is rigged. The palace learns to walk on air. Doors close softly now. Footsteps fade. No one lingers unless summoned, because Henry is afraid. Not of death, not yet, but of losing command. The man who once bent institutions now suspects that everyone around him is waiting for his weakness. And in this state, the old obsessions return. Blood, loyalty, control. Execution orders continue to be signed. Even as his hands shake, even as he struggles to hold the pen, the body fails, and the mind compensates the only way it knows how. By tightening its grip on others. Religion offers no refuge. One day, Henry demands familiar rituals, old prayers, the comfort of tradition. The next, he rejects them with fury, insisting on his own authority. Faith no longer steadies him. It torments him. He wakes from nightmares soaked in sweat, gasping for air. Eyes wide, heart racing. In these moments, the king is no longer terrifying. He is terrified. Attendants record him calling out in the dark, begging forgiveness, arguing with invisible figures, denying accusations that no one in the room has made. You understand what this is. It is guilt, stripped of distance. For decades, Henry controlled the narrative. He decided who was right, who was a traitor, who deserved to die. Now the story is being told back to him, without his permission. The faces return in his dreams, silent, watching, and for the first time in his life, Henry cannot order them away. Paranoia sets in. He becomes convinced that factions are already forming, that plans are already in motion, that his death is being anticipated. And he is not wrong. But knowing this does not steady him. It unravels him. Henry vacillates between lucidity and near delirium, between cold calculation and raw fear. In one moment, he revises his will with obsessive precision. In the next, he clutches the bedclothes as if they are the only thing anchoring him to the world. Power no longer feels permanent. It feels fragile. And fragility is something Henry VIII has never tolerated, in himself or anyone else. This is the cruelest stage of his decline, because the mind is still sharp enough to understand what is happening, but no longer strong enough to stop it. The king is trapped inside his own failing body, haunted by his own decisions, surrounded by people who obey him, but no longer believe in him. And as the nights stretch longer, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Henry VIII is not just dying. He is afraid of what waits for him when he dies. That fear will shape everything that follows. Because when power senses its end, it does not soften. It strikes. By now, Henry VIII is barely conscious, but the machinery of power is fully awake. You stand inside Whitehall as the king drifts in and out of awareness, his breathing shallow, his body failing, and yet orders still move outward from this room. Execution warrants are placed before him. His hand shakes. His grip is weak, but the signature is still his. Ink stains the parchment. Men will die because of it. Even now, this is the final expression of Henry's rule. Authority exercised without strength, violence without movement. Around him, the court does not mourn. It calculates. You can feel the shift. The question is no longer, will the king survive? It is, what happens when he doesn't? The center of gravity moves away from the bed. quietly, carefully, because Henry VIII understands something terrifyingly well. His death is dangerous, not because England will grieve, but because England will scramble. The heir is a child. Edward is 9 years old, thin, frail, easily shaped. Whoever controls him will rule the kingdom. And everyone in this palace knows it. Factions harden. On one side, the conservative noblesmen who survived decades by mastering Henry's volatility. On the other, the reformers disciplined, patient, already thinking beyond the king. You watch them study one another in silence. Every word weighed, every pause measured. No one makes the first move. Not yet. Henry is still alive. Barely. But even in this state, he strikes. The Duke of Norfolk, once one of the most powerful men in England, is condemned for treason. The sentence is signed in the dying king's name. It is a warning. Henry may be fading, but his claws are still sharp. Norfolk is sent to the Tower, awaiting execution. Only one thing saves him: time. Because before the axe can fall, Henry VIII does. The king dies in the early hours of the morning. There is no cry, no proclamation, no public moment, just a body that finally stops breathing. And then silence. Not the silence of grief, the silence of control. For 3 days, England is not told. The king is dead, but no one outside this palace is allowed to know. His corpse lies cooling in the royal chamber, while power reorganizes itself around it. This is deliberate, because death creates a vacuum, and vacuums are dangerous. So while Henry's body remains unseen, Edward Seymour moves. Meetings are held behind closed doors. Orders are issued quietly. Key fortresses are secured. Potential rivals are isolated, neutralized, or sidelined. By the time the bells finally toll, the outcome is already decided. Edward Seymour is named Lord Protector. Not by Henry's will, but by momentum. The Regency Council Henry designed to rule collectively is overridden almost immediately. The dying king's final attempt to control the future collapses within days of his death. And the irony is brutal. Henry VIII spent his life centralizing power, crushing rivals, bending institutions to his will. Yet the moment he is gone, that same system shifts without him. Obedience transfers. Courtiers bow to Edward VI's throne even when the child is not present. Ritual continues. Authority survives. But the man who embodied it is already irrelevant. There is no time for mourning. England has moved on. Henry's body remains behind, guarded, ignored, politically useless. The lion is dead, but the hunt has already begun. And as the new regime settles into place, one truth becomes clear. Henry VIII did not die peacefully. He died as he lived, surrounded by fear, used by power, and replaced without hesitation. What remains now is not the king. It is the corpse. And the story that will be told about him, that is where the final transformation begins. Henry VIII is dead. What remains is a problem. You stand in Whitehall, not before a king, but before a body vast, heavy, already changing. Death has not brought peace. It has brought urgency. The corpse begins to decompose with alarming speed. This is not whispered rumor. It is documented. The infected wounds that ravaged Henry's legs in life now accelerate decay in death. The flesh swells. Gases build beneath the skin. The royal embalmers work quickly and in shock. They open the body, removing organs that are already diseased. The liver is enlarged and damaged. The heart engorged. They pack the cavities with fragrant herbs and preservatives, trying to slow what cannot be stopped. Even for men accustomed to death, the state of the king's body is disturbing. This is not how a monarch is meant to end. Henry's coffin must be specially constructed. Wider, heavier, reinforced. It takes extra bearers to move it. The weight is extraordinary. During the lying-in state, something goes wrong. The lead-lined coffin splits under pressure. Decomposition gases force their way out. Fluids leak onto the floor of the chapel. The incident is hastily concealed, but not before witnesses see it. Not before dogs are reported to have licked at the seepage, a grotesque final humiliation for a king obsessed with majesty. And yet, above the coffin, another body is presented. A wax effigy of Henry VIII. This Henry is upright, powerful, unchanged, dressed in full regalia, eyes open, posture commanding. This is the body England is allowed to see. The decaying corpse is hidden beneath layers of ritual, stone, and silence, because the myth must survive. The funeral procession moves toward Windsor Castle in February 1547. Black-draped horses pull the enormous coffin through cold streets. Bells toll. Mourners watch. But the image they carry away is not the bloated, rotting body sealed inside lead. It is the Henry of memory, the Henry of portraits. At St. George's Chapel, Henry is laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the wife who gave him a son, the wife who died before she could fall from favor. In death, as in life, she is the only one allowed to remain beside him. The tomb Henry planned for himself is never completed. He had envisioned a monument that would dwarf all others: bronze figures, towering structures, an equestrian statue proclaiming eternal power. Financial reality intervenes. The grand design is abandoned. The irony is sharp. The king who controlled images so obsessively cannot control his own memorial. But his true monument has already been built. It exists in paint. Court artists like Hans Holbein created the Henry that history would remember. Wide-legged, broad-shouldered, defiant. That image bears little resemblance to the man who died gasping in a darkened room, his body betraying him piece by piece. And yet, it endures. The myth outlives the flesh. Henry's will is read. 30 pages of control from beyond the grave. The succession is laid out precisely. Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. Against expectation, it will be followed almost exactly. Henry's grip on England extends through all 3 of his children. Even death does not loosen it entirely. But the reality of power shifts. The Regency Council Henry designed is quickly undermined. Edward Seymour dominates. The Protector rules. Henry's final attempt to manage the future fails within days. What remains of him is memory and fear. In the years that follow, England reshapes itself again and again. Protestant reform under Edward. Catholic restoration under Mary. A careful middle way under Elizabeth. Each ruler claims Henry as their foundation. Each bends his legacy to their needs. And the man himself recedes. The medical mystery lingers. Doctors and historians argue across centuries. Diabetes, gout, infection, trauma. Perhaps all of them. What is certain is this: Henry VIII did not die as a god king. He died as a man whose body could no longer sustain the power he had forced upon it. In his final days, stripped of movement, stripped of certainty, Henry faced the same truth as every subject he had ruled: that titles do not follow you into death. That authority dissolves. That the body always has the last word. And yet, the story does not end with the corpse. Because power does not require flesh. It requires belief. And Henry VIII understood that better than anyone. He left behind a myth strong enough to eclipse the truth, a portrait bold enough to replace the body, and a legacy so dominant that even his decay could not erase it. You have watched the lion die. What you are left with is the warning. When power becomes identity, the body becomes expendable, and history will remember the image. not the rot beneath it. You have seen how the lion died, not in glory, not in triumph, but beneath layers of ritual, stone, and silence. Henry VIII believed power could outlive the body. And in one sense, he was right. History remembers the image, not the rot beneath it. But the body always tells the truth in the end. And it leaves us with a warning that no crown, no myth, and no authority can ever escape.